Welcome into Phil's Tax Hacks and Other Retirement Facts with CPA and personal financial specialist, Phil Putney. Now let's get rolling with today's show. Hey everybody, welcome into Phil's Tax Hacks and Other Retirement Facts with Phil Putney and myself. Here to talk about, is retirement planning harder than it used to be? And Phil, I'm sure our parents, at least my dad and probably your dad, used to tell you, oh, you have no idea how hard it used to be. I used to have to walk to school, in the snow, uphill, both ways. Yep. Right? They would always say the most exaggerated things, right? But you know what? Is retirement planning harder today than it was 40 years ago or even 30 years ago? And I think maybe the answer probably is yes in a lot of ways, but also it's easier. So we're going to talk about that this week.
Sounds good. Yeah, there's definitely some challenges today that didn't exist, for maybe our parents, but for sure our grandparents, depending on ages and whatever. But yeah, for my age, my demographic, yeah. So
yeah, that's very true. So what we're going to do is we're going to break this. We got 10 points we're going to go over. We'll do 5 and 5 over the next 2 podcasts. We tend to do this quite a lot. It gets us a chance to get all the content in there. But I think it's interesting to kind of think about this viewpoint because right now, our world and society, people are constantly, you're on social media, you're constantly seeing people say, oh, it just was so much easier before and we've just overcomplicated things. And it's really happening in all sorts of facets of life. Yet sometimes there's also easier things. So it's like, it's an interesting catch-22 because, if you went back to the 70s and someone would say, well, it was harder then than it was 20 years before that. So it's kind of a little bit of recency bias.
I think it's kind of nature, right? Human nature. It's kind of nature. I always think we've got it harder than, somebody else, but
right.
There is some truth
even though
to
the technology, even though all of our technology now is supposed to make our life easier, but we all know
I still don't buy that. So
yeah. Well, we'll get into it.
We'll get into it. So
we'll have a little conversation about it. So let's start off with our first one here, which is going to be job stability and company loyalty. Now, certainly in the Michigan area, right, where you're based out of, you got the big three. Right. Definitely that's, a case where that's probably more existent than other parts of the country. Where you've got people that work there for 30 years or so on and so forth. Yeah. But that mentality has definitely shifted over the last 30, 40 years. And people do not have those long career loyalty jobs anymore, which, obviously plays into the pension conversation.
Yeah. I mean, and that's a big shift I've started to see. I mean, I still occasionally will get clients that have worked for one company for their whole career. This is where they took their dream job, so to speak, out of college. And, they've worked there their entire career and are now retiring from that company, which again has some challenges too, because a lot of times, and we talked about this before, in concentrated stock positions and things like that, is you get all this loyalty to the one company, but it has definitely made their career a lot easier. They probably have a pension from that company, they know what to expect. But that's few and far between anymore. I don't know what the national average is today, but I think it's like a 5-year stint is kind of the longevity at the job. Mm-hmm. So and it's just kind of the nature of the beast anymore. And I don't think it's I think it goes both ways on both sides. It's not necessarily the employee that is the one that is getting dissatisfied and they're moving on. Okay. I don't think the loyalty is there as much as it used to be from a company standpoint either.
That's a good point.
So I think it kind of goes both ways. It's an interesting view from retirement for somebody like that, because they've maybe changed, job 3, 4, 5, the younger generation, by the time they get to retirement, 6, 8, 9 times, who knows? I mean, it's,
Baker's dozen.
Yep.
So let me frame it this way. So think about like the 3 legs of a milking stool, right? Yep. You got 3 legs of a stool, whatever, I don't know why I said milking stool, but whatever. You got 3 legs on a stool, right? And so, usually you have your pension from this, from this long time thing, you have your Social Security, and you might have nothing or a very modest personal savings, and you were good to go. Now I'm going to flip our next numbers here. So I'm going to go to number 2 and actually make this the less reliance on personal savings. I don't know why we changed the order here. So a number 2 is less reliance on personal savings. Well, now that stool is the legs are completely different. And there's a whole lot more that you got to try to balance on that one leg of personal savings. And the changes to the Secure Act, the government, they're saying, hey, make sure that you realize that you've got to, take care of yourself here.
Right. Absolutely. And that has been one of the effects of the shift with employment, and I think part of the
Right.
reason that people have started to move away from employers easier is there's not as many golden handcuffs, so to speak, right? I mean, back in the day, you
Correct.
had the
Yeah.
pension, you had the, whatever it was, all these different factors that played into having loyalty to that company. Well, if
Right.
you don't have that, there's not as many incentives for the loyalty, so
So now I got to chase
the
more
next
money so
best,
I can
yeah,
build
the
my
next
own.
best offer comes about from,
Yeah.
money, time off, whatever it is. Well, then let's go to that company because your 401k is yours. You take it with you. It's portable. So I mean, there's pros and cons. It's you have that advantage, that flexibility now, but to your point of reliance on personal savings, with that, the loss of the pension has been part of it. And I think the company shifted away from the pension, almost pushing employees into this, just from their own standpoint, because a company with a pension has this potential liability on their balance sheets. And we've seen this
Right.
shift over the last 10 years start to diminish dramatically. There's very, very, very few companies that have pensions in place anymore. Public companies specifically, most of them, even if they do, they're frozen. So the people that are in it is it. Once they've retired, that pension is gone. New employees, maybe in the last 10 years have not been or more have not been eligible to come in. So
Well, think about what I mentioned. The government is kind of saying, hey, with the Secure Act changes,
yeah,
we got to do some more stuff. So if you're more reliant now on yourself to
right.
save for retirement, which we all know, but people have not been doing it,
Yes.
right? And not been doing it well. So the last couple of changes with the Secure Act, they're starting to put more rules in there that kind of almost force you
in.
or force the company
Right.
that you might be working at to help you save, because they realize, okay, look, we've shifted away from pensions, we've gone into this personal savings, but people are not putting the
They're
money
not
away
preparing themselves for it.
and they're
Yeah.
not preparing themselves, and right, and so that's a real problem. So you have got to have that as part of your strategy and planning.
Right.
To the self-discipline, I suppose, is not there to pay your future self.
Right. And that's any shift, I think, in anything over time. That's just a learning process, right? That as people start to make that shift into the personal savings is something new. Now, for our generation, younger generations, for sure, it's not the new. It's just what it is. So I think it's going to be more just normal in what they do. For this middle generation, that part of them have the pension, part of them don't. I think that's where we've seen a lot of this. They haven't saved enough because they saw their parents have the pension, have the three-legged stool, but their savings was a very small piece of it. So they're thinking, oh, that's how that's going to work for me. And maybe they started with a pension, but now they've got a very small pension. Well, they never really made up for the difference and started doing personal savings. And now as generations have shifted, the younger generation, even our generation, I mean, we don't have pensions.
Right.
It's never been part of the equation. So for us, it's more natural to save for retirement.
I
But
think a lot of it's all going to be personal too. It's just like credit card debt, right? So
absolutely.
some people are going to be very good and very
Yes.
mindful of saying, you know what, I have got to pay my future self. I don't want to be broke when I'm older.
Right.
And other people are very right now, and they're like, you know what, I need this money right now for something else, so I'm not going to put it into my 401k off the check this week, or whatever the case is. So again, that's why we're having some of the governmental kind of influence starting to step in here
Yeah.
the last couple of years when it comes to the Roths and the 401ks, and just making it a little easier, hopefully, for people to get on the train, right?
Right.
So they can take care of themselves.
Yeah, and there's always pros and cons. I mean, and we talked a few weeks back about comparing, I think it was the ranking of different countries from, retirement readiness and the different things.
Yeah.
In America ranked relatively low is what you think it would, being, the nation we are. And that's
Right.
the main reason, is that there is a lot of personal responsibility in that,
Yeah.
which has pros and cons. The pro is that you can do a lot with it, but you have to take that responsibility on.
True.
And that's
Very
where
true.
to your point, I think we've started to see the government trying to encourage, even force, or put rules in place to make
Right.
it happen, which, I mean, isn't necessarily a bad thing.
Well, if you're not going
to, it's at the
yeah.
end of the day. And if you're not going to do it, what are you going to do in retirement? Just live on Social Security. That's not feasible anymore. So,
well, sometimes you got to lead the children, right? You got to help them out a little bit. So
hopefully you're a good graces with the kids. So
That's right. Let's go to number 3, housing stability. So again, the topic being retirement planning is harder today than it used to
yep,
be. Now, a couple of years ago, Phil, I bought this house that I live in 7 years ago and got it for a great price and a low interest rate.
yep,
Since then, in the last 7 years, the last 5 years, 4 years, really, we've seen the housing market go through the roof. And I absolutely do sympathize. I mean, my daughter's 27 years old, and I absolutely
yeah,
empathize with people trying to buy a house right now because the prices are so ridiculously inflated. Like if you go on Zillow and
yeah,
you look at a house that you're interested in and you see what it's listing for right now, let's say it's 500,000, and you just go back 4 years, the same exact house was listed for half that,
yeah.
you know? And so in that respect, it's definitely harder.
And with interest rates right now too, it just
And with interest rates.
compounds that problem. But I mean, this is an interesting topic too, the housing side of it, because I think this almost relates to topic one to some extent with job stability. I mean, if you think back in the
Okay.
day, I mean, if you work for the same company for 30 years, chances are you might not ever move, right? Or not out of that
Right.
city or that region you're in. So why, you don't have that need to move unless you wanted
That's
to,
true. That's a good point. Interesting.
versus if you're moving or working for different companies, then where does that position take you? Is it to another state? So now you're
Mm,
having to move. So, I mean, I think that might have played into it some. So,
interesting. Yeah, I
and I mean,
like
if
that.
you look
It's a
back even further, like my grandparents, I mean, they owned a farm. Well, I mean, you're on the farm. That's
right.
it, man. It's, they were there for, I think they owned the farm 40, 50 years.
Yeah.
That's what you had. That's your house. You think of
Yeah.
moving, you're
And you
not
start
moving.
moving and it definitely adds to it. That's an interesting take. I hadn't
So,
really thought about it
but yeah,
that
I mean,
way.
it does definitely add some challenges, as you get into
Yeah.
retirement of, you have a mortgage, number one. I mean, if you've been in a house, the same house for 30, 40 years, hopefully you've got the mortgage paid off, at that point. But I mean, if you're moving, you may not, right? Because maybe you
Yeah.
increase the house size or whatever it is throughout time, or so it just brings another wrinkle into the equation. So
Yeah, for sure. Okay, let's talk about number 4, simpler investing. And so less options back in the day, right? Certainly, so that made it a little bit easier. So in that regard, we have a whole lot more plethora. But I feel like that's a good thing, right? So we have a lot more options now. Let's just go with a simple technology conversation: mutual funds to ETFs, right? Before the '90s, there was no ETFs because the technology didn't allow for it. Basically, you had the mutual fund standard. Well, ETFs have pretty much replaced mutual funds for the most part, right? A lot of people do that more because it's just a little bit better of a product, very similar, but it just kind of works a little bit better. So in that regard, I think it's a little easier nowadays.
yeah, and there's definitely pros and cons, but at the high level, those are some improvements. I mean, even the invention of the mutual fund. I mean, that was a huge improvement because now the individual investor didn't have to, with a small investment, pick one company to invest in. They
Right.
could invest in a basket of companies with a smaller investment. So that's a great, invention at that point.
Absolutely.
ETFs is kind of the same thing, taking that mutual fund concept to the next level, making it more efficient in how that vehicle works.
Right.
So those pieces I think have been good, but then where the complexity and the craziness starts to come in is, well, now you can invest in inverse funds, right? So I mean, you can bet against the market, both direction. And so there's all these complexities of what you can invest in, and even the ETFs have
That's a good point, though. The
brought that.
technology is
Yeah,
the technology has given us so much more, but it's also confusing much more
well,
because
that's
you can also now
right.
get lost in a sea of stuff.
Right. And that's the challenge that an investor faces today. If they're just researching, well, what do I invest in? Well, yeah, you can stick simple, but I mean, it's just endless. And ETFs have
Yeah.
compounded that because they're, a much more efficient type of vehicle. There's all different flavors of ETFs that you can get into versus mutual funds. There weren't quite as many, which again gives some advantages to an investor, because if they want to have a very narrow investment strategy, just looking at a very specific sector of companies, they can do that more efficiently in an ETF than they could have maybe a mutual fund. There might not have even been a
Yeah.
mutual fund that did that. So,
Yeah. Good point.
yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
it does make, if you're investing yourself, a little bit more of a challenge now, because again, options, right? You have more options, but now you've got to educate yourself on what those options are. and make sure
Yeah.
you do understand what you're getting invested into, because it might look really good, but what's the pro and the con? What's
Yeah.
the downside
Okay.
of that investment?
Yeah. And it is easy to get lost, right? We know that. We've definitely had lots of
Yep.
conversations about that. So on the one hand, I think it's good too, because you can be and I think we've seen that. I talk to advisors all across the country, and more people see folks coming in with good questions and
Right.
armed with some good information.
Absolutely.
But they still definitely get a little bit confused and down in some of the weeds. And so therefore they're also looking for, like, how much of this is accurate,
Right.
because as we've learned, the internet's full of, information and disinformation. So,
Yes.
a little bit of
Yeah.
pros and cons
Yep.
there for
I
sure.
always look at the source. What's the reason they're posting or putting this information out there? So,
Yeah. Okay. Well, let's do our fifth one, and then we'll wrap it up for this week.
yep.
And it's talking about interest rates. So higher interest rates back in the day, somebody would say, well, that was great. So in 1980, Phil, you could have a 10-year treasury bond paying at about 11%, 11.3% roughly, in that neighborhood. And people are like, great, that's awesome.
Yeah.
You could get a CD at 1980, national average was 15% on a CD.
Yep.
Again, fantastic. But your mortgage rate was also 13%.
Right.
That was the 1980 national average. Now it's going to be higher and lower
Yeah.
in different places throughout the country. So it's kind of in the same boat as it is today. If you think about those minor discrepancies, yeah, maybe you can get 4% on a CD right now, and you were lucky enough to have a 3% mortgage from just 7 years ago, like myself, or something like
Right.
that. So you're making just a
A
little
little bit
bit,
of an
but it's
edge
not
of,
enough
yeah.
you're not going to move the needle a ton.
Yeah, and that's interest rate. We've talked about interest rates before, but it's always the challenge. People like to focus on interest rates now at this specific time, right? Like, oh, the 80s was great. I can get 12%. Well, that's great. 14, 15%, whatever it was.
Yeah,
That's awesome in a quote unquote secure investment. But the reality is, if you look over any period of time in more than just 1 year, 1 year's, you're going to have these discrepancies, right?
sure.
But
Yeah,
anything bank related, bank products, the interest that you're earning there is never going to keep up with inflation. That's not what they're designed to do.
right,
So you can't get
right.
fixated on the number and say, oh, if I could just have a 12% CD today. Trust me, you don't want it, because to your point, if we're getting a 12% CD, well, chances are your mortgage rates are 10. We're probably
10. Yeah,
11, 12, 13% inflation. I mean, there's
yeah.
the downside of that high interest rates. It just didn't happen.
Yeah. And we can call it 4%, whatever they're claiming it is. We know it's still higher than that right now in a lot of ways,
Right.
right? We've talked about that a number of times. And, as a matter of fact, it was just, we're about a few days removed from the Super Bowl, Phil. And I
Yep.
about lost my mind when I saw, unfortunately, the president standing out there talking about shrinkflation. And it's not even, first of all, that's not even
What?
a real thing. And the way he was describing what's going on with, your Super Bowl snacks might be less and blah blah, and it was like, you're really just describing inflation. Literally, what it
Exactly.
is inflation, but you're trying to spin it and make it seem like it's something better.
Right.
And which is, we know our politicians of both
Right.
sides
That's
and
just the
all
spin.
around,
That's what they try
all
to
they
do.
do is
Yeah.
spin everything to make stuff try to sound better. And it's like, look, we're not all idiots here. Okay,
Yeah.
this is truly, it's inflation, right? So
Yeah.
it's a hard pill to swallow.
Yeah. And I mean, the other thing to think about with the interest rates is, back when this happened the last time, higher interest rates like this, well, we didn't have as much reliance on personal savings either. So your
Right.
your
It's all playing
need your
together.
need was more filled with pensions, which, granted, I mean, the downside to pensions, especially in that time frame, is most of those were not inflation adjusted. So that's when
And
somebody
usually
had
they
a,
aren't today either.
yeah, most of them aren't today, unless it's, a governmental entity usually is the only ones that have any kind of inflation. So, but yeah, I mean, that's one of the biggest downsides to the pension is it's fixed. So if you've had a 6, 7, 8, 10% inflation, I mean, you're losing substantial purchasing power. So Social Security fortunately has had some inflation adjustments over time it never keeps up with it, but at least it moves in the same direction, lagging it somewhat. But
So is retirement planning harder today than it used to be? Yeah.
I would think
And
so.
no.
Yeah. I mean, there's more. So is it harder? Maybe not harder, more complex, right? There's more
Okay.
options. There's more
Okay.
moving parts to it. For at least like my grandparents, it was pretty basic, right? I mean, you had a pension, Social Security was kind of the two main cores for them. They also had the farm, that they ended up selling. So they had more in the personal savings, but more traditional retirees back then was a pension and Social Security. So I mean, it was pretty easy. This is when you filed, this is when you retired, and here's your income. So
yeah. Yeah. The A to B was an easier line than it is now. Right
today.
now, it kind of does
Yep.
all of this, and then you finally get there. All right. Well, there you go. That's the first half. So we'll be back with 5 more points to talk about on retirement planning changes over the years with Phil Putney. And of course, if you got some questions, need some help, find him online at philstaxhacks.com. That's philstaxhacks.com. Don't forget to subscribe to us on Apple or Spotify in audio form, and of course on YouTube in video form. Hit that little subscribe button and ring the little notification bell, and that way you can catch new episodes when they come out and all that good jazz. And we'll see you next time right here on Phil's Tax Hacks and other retirement facts.
Investment advisory services offered through AFS Wealth Management. The content of this program is provided for informational purposes only and is not a solicitation or recommendation of any investment strategy. Investments and/or investment strategies involve risk, including the possible loss of principal. There is no assurance that any investment strategy will achieve its objectives.